with about 2 after here, let's jump in and get started. I'm Adam Elson, Director of Partnerships here at InfoTrust. Thank you for joining our Tinuiti and InfoTrust webinar on Mastering Measurement, Methods for Reliable Attribution in a Confusing Cookie World. There are thousands of combinations of analytics setups, data collection, all of that can cause a less than clear picture for attribution. So when we talk about measurement, there's measurement for machine learning, there's measurement for hands-on practitioners, there's measurement for executives, all with different needs here. All that to say, there's multiple sources of truth that plague a lot of the companies that come to both InfoTrust and Tinuiti. So here, we'll look to bring some clarity for reliable attribution with our 2 presenters, Pam Castricone and Simon Poulton.
Howdy.
For Pam, to introduce them, Pam's published over 20 resources on the InfoTrust site. You may have seen her on some of our other webinars. She is an emerging solutions strategist here, leading the development of emerging data science solutions to enhance marketing ROI using first-party data, and that will be a theme. For Simon, you've likely seen him on webinars, on his podcast called Measure Up, or on stage at any number of speaking events he goes to. He's the EVP of Innovation and Growth at Tinuiti, leading the search, social, commerce, media, operations, TV, audio, and display. This better not be on a business card. I
don't even got a business card post-COVID. It's all digital, so you can just throw in as many words as you want.
Perfect. So Simon, all those things, EVP of Innovation and Growth at Tinuiti. So you might be new to InfoTrust or to Tinuiti, and yes, there is a partnership here. So Tinuiti and InfoTrust, we collaborate on first-party data strategies for increased activation, ensuring quality data collection from the start so that we can rely on that data we use. If any of the things that you see today, if any of it resonates with you during, after, reach out. There's also going to be a survey at the end that will make sure there's an easy option for you to click and say, yeah, I'd like to learn more, or just sit back and enjoy the webinar. With that, I will hand it over to you, Simon.
Wonderful. Thank you for the kind intro. And of course, you've all joined us here today to talk about attribution. But actually, I want to talk about something else that I am always trying to figure out. And that is, why did Tom Brady go to Tampa Bay? He had an incredibly decorated career with the Patriots. There was no reason for him to come back to the league. But for whatever reason, he did. And one of the theories, and you may remember this, is there was a Super Bowl commercial a few years ago. It was a T-Mobile commercial where Tom Brady and Gronk are on the phone together. And Tom's talking to him, and he's like, I think I'm going to hang my cleats up. I think I'm done. I think I'm going to move down to Tampa Bay, get a nice little house by the beach, and just, live my senior years down there. And that, it was a lovely statement of his retirement. But what was interesting about that commercial was that it was about dropped calls, and it was about how they can be staticky. So on the other end of the line, there was Gronk, and what he heard was, hey, I'm going to go to Tampa Bay, get my cleats. And it was one of those moments that I just saw, and I was like, that's a real life attribution moment. There's this data inconsistency moment. And so what happened in the commercial, of course, is Gronk heard, we're going to Tampa Bay, we're going to play. And they both unretired. Now, I'm sure that that's not what happened in real life. I'm sure there were just very large checks that were cut in different directions. But it was this interesting moment in time where I thought a lot about this pattern matching that we all go through, or frankly, making these decisions based on incomplete data sets. So whenever we're thinking about these deterministic scenarios just like this, it's not too far away from the real world. And I'm sure you've had a situation like this where you've been in a boardroom or you've been in a meeting with senior stakeholders, and you end up having a conversation that is ultimately tied to a deterministic last touch strategy. And I think a lot of us inherently know this is not the best approach, but it is the way that we've operated. And I think humans are just natural pattern matchers. We like to find consistency or patterns, even when those things are not possible. And I think this is the fundamental challenge when we're talking about attribution, is this idea of data completeness and deterministic decisioning. But before we go even deeper on what the inherent challenges are and how we're thinking about solving them, I think we're going to talk about what attribution actually is.
Yes, thank you, Simon. So let's get clear about what we mean when we say marketing attribution. Attribution modeling is a technique used in marketing to figure out which parts of your marketing efforts are making people take action, like completing a purchase or signing up for a service. There are a number of different ways attribution has been done, and it's been around for a long time. Like Simon alluded to, deterministic or rules-based models are things that most marketers are familiar with. And the way that they work is that those models follow a predefined set of rules to assign credit to specific touch points in the customer journey. So very commonly, you'll see a last touch model where 100% of the credit for a user's conversion is given to the last marketing touch point that preceded the conversion. On the flip side, there is also a first interaction model where 100% of credit goes to the first touch point. And then there are multi-touch models, which assign credit across multiple of those touch points in the user's journey. These models are straightforward, very widely used, easy to implement, and I think for all of those reasons, they are very commonly used even in the industry today. But they're not the only ones. A second class of model is what we'll call probabilistic attribution models. These are advanced models that use statistics or machine learning to analyze and consider all of the interactions across the user's journey, and then distribute that credit based on how the model determines that each touch point contributed to the final conversion. So for the purposes of today's session, we'll be talking about two categories of probabilistic models: traditional marketing mix models, or MMMs, and then what we're calling faster MMMs, with a focus on digital marketing. Probabilistic models are more flexible than rule-based models and just generally do a better job capturing the complexity of how customers engage with marketing in the real world. But before we go any farther, we need to stop and pause and remind ourselves why this even matters. If, one of the things that we hope you walk away with from today's session is the importance of not losing sight on the fact that attribution modeling is just a tool. And the way that it actually provides value to the organization is by guiding action. I personally would argue that a model is worthless if no one in the organization is actually using it to try to achieve better marketing outcomes. We'll return to this point a few more times, just to emphasize how important it is that any model that you choose, deterministic or probabilistic, it's not going to provide any value unless someone somewhere is using it to try to drive better marketing outcomes. But before we get any farther, I do want to address two of the drawbacks of deterministic attribution models. The first is the complexity of the modern customer journey. I read a statistic recently from Boston Consulting Group. The average customer journey now includes anywhere from 50 to 200 marketing touchpoints. So with that many marketing messages in play, it's practically impossible to construct a data set that would accurately represent that entire sequence of touchpoints, let alone feel confident that a rules-based model is adequately able to assign credit across all of those touchpoints. And then the second drawback being that rules-based models are essentially frozen in time. They have no calibration mechanism and really have not evolved despite how much the industry has changed and the way consumers interact with brands. But
sorry, Pam, didn't mean to.
No, I was just going to pass it back to you, Simon. But
yeah. Well, it's an interesting. We haven't evolved that much. On my podcast, Jim and I like to refer to ourselves as recovering MTA-aholics, because the Kool-Aid is really nice to drink, and it is. This idea of like, well, what if though? What if you could get it perfect? What if your business model is simple enough that it is easier? And this is something that I've thought a lot about, and transparently, this is one of those moments in time where I have to, I guess, share some information about myself. I have, in the past, I built an attribution tool. I built one using the Facebook or the Meta Atlas tag that was able to get a very somewhat complete set of data. And we were able to use a data-driven, we were able to apply Shapley values on top. And it was interesting, but not useful. And I think that is the inherent challenge here, right? Is what if you did have that immaculate data? What if you did have that calibrated rules-based model? Would it even be of value? And this is a question I like to pose to folks, because I think there's often been a pursuit of this idea of attribution and not necessarily a pursuit of utility or what questions you'd think about answering. In fact, I think the fundamental challenge that we're talking about here is that attribution is always looking in the rear view mirror. So it's like if you're on the next slide. Yep, perfect. It's like if you're it's like you're driving a car and you are going down the road, but all you can see is what is behind you. That's not a great way to drive a car, because it creates this, great, I know that I didn't hit anything behind me, but I probably only want to drive that car down the road at like 10 miles an hour because I don't know what's in front of me. What if there's a cliff in front of me? This is the challenge on the road ahead on the next slide here. The challenge of the road ahead is that you don't know how far you can go, right? When will you hit your point of diminishing returns? The whole point of this is if you are always retroactive or retrospective with your approach to attribution, it doesn't enable forward-looking decisioning. And I think what we really need to move on from as marketers to a degree is this idea of, I don't want to say patting ourselves on the back, but it is this sort of exercise in credit assignment. And it's like, hey, we did a great job back then, but it doesn't tell me where to spend my next best dollar. And I think this is maybe one of the fractures that we've observed between CMOs and CFOs over the years, is fundamentally we're not necessarily talking about the future. We're not thinking about where do you spend your next best dollar. And I think that is exactly what I'm trying to evangelize at this moment in time. And frankly, I'm still shocked sometimes when I have to have these conversations repetitively, but it is not a worthwhile endeavor to go too far down this path. And while it may have worked once, I still see folks who really, really, really want to go in on Google Analytics. And if you look at the Google Analytics product roadmap and what they've done, they got rid of the Google attribution tool. Paul Pellman is gone, right? Like that was a moment in time. They turned around on this 5 years ago, and yet a lot of folks still want to use the platform for that. In fact, there was a recent eMarketer study, which I thought was pretty interesting, where they found that US marketers believe that who believe last click measurement is an accurate reflection of a platform's long-term impact on business, keyword long-term. 22% of you, or not you, maybe if you're on this line, if you're on this this webinar today, you're probably at least open to future interpretations. But 22% of folks still definitely think this is true. That is absurdly high. And then 40% of folks say, yeah, sort of. I don't think that is a reasonable take in the modern era. And it is a real problem because attribution is multi-layered. I think when we're talking about attribution, we need to think about who are we serving with attribution, right? Because there is a time and a place where deterministic attribution actually has value. So I like to think about it in what I've framed as the 3 bodies of measurement. So the first one is measurement for machines. This is when we're thinking about feeding the algorithm. So what data is being shared with the ad platforms in order to optimize the algorithm in a form of a feedback loop. This is fundamentally deterministic, and that's not a bad thing. In fact, that is a requirement. But the problem is machines are always looking in the mirror and they're only seeing themselves, right? So if we've all gone through this exercise, you add up the number of conversions from Facebook and from Google and from whatever other platforms are self-reporting, and you end up with 3 times the number of the total conversions. That is not a good exercise, but there is value for the machines in having those deterministic feedback loops. So it's still very important that we keep a focus on that. The second body is measurement for media managers. And I think about a distinction here is, well, yeah, they're still operating within the walls of those gardens. They're still operating within the walls of those platforms. And they're still having to react to what the deterministic feedback loop is guiding them toward. But they do have to make certain decisions as it pertains to in-platform signals relative to out-of-platform signals. So they sort of have to sit in this interesting middle ground between the fully deterministic data that we want to feed the machines and then what we have on the far end here, which is measurement for executives. Measurement for executives, I think about this far more broadly than just attribution. I think about it in all kinds of KPIs. There's no value in reporting bounce rate to a CMO. There could be some value in reporting a bounce rate to a media manager. They might make some decisions on that, right? But measurement for executives really needs to be this forward-looking approach. It needs to be based on the outcome-based measurement framework. And critically, and this is what I was just talking about before, it needs to be looking forward about where do you swing your next best dollar. And this is where I have made it one of my life missions to ensure that I can at least be part of making CMOs and CFOs best friends on their journey together. So I bring this up because not all measurement approaches will fit each of these bodies, and there is still relevance and use for some deterministic solutions as well as modeled solutions. This is why this is multi-layered and complex. But it doesn't end there. It gets a little bit more complicated because we also have these privacy challenges. And I think we alluded today with we talked about cookieless in the title of the webinar, which maybe is perhaps a slight misnomer because if all the first-party cookies went away, the internet just wouldn't function anymore. But we've already been operating in a world without third-party cookies now for years. I want to say 5 years maybe is how long it's been since they were deprecated in Safari. The point of this, though, is that there are these three functions that we need to be really mindful of when we're thinking, look, even if we can get the data, should we? There are these technical limits, things like intelligent tracking prevention or enhanced tracking prevention in Safari and Firefox, respectively. There are these legislative constraints associated with what data can be ported across systems. Of course, GDPR is the big one that comes to mind, but even here in the United States, we've got 19 state-level privacy laws on the books. That is pretty wild when you think about trying to deal with that scope of data storage and data portability. So there's an inherent push toward the anonymized individual, right? This again, even if you could, it doesn't mean you should, but now you can't. And then finally, there's the consumer sentiment piece. And I often like to think, what if whatever I was doing, what if this was on the front page of the New York Times tomorrow? Do I think, one, the average consumer would understand the nuance that I'm talking about? And then two, would I be embarrassed by that? And I think critically, if we look in the mirror, I think we might say, yeah, we might be a little embarrassed by the Tim Wilson calls it the fetishization of PII. And I think that is a very real construct and one that we need to be really mindful of. So these three together really frame up this picture of the deterministic signals are not going to work at this macro level, and we have to be really mindful about what the future looks like. So this is all set in the foundation, and now I think we're ready to talk about how do we mature this approach in the modern era.
Yes. So let's talk about 4 key components for you on that journey toward measurement maturity. First one being goal setting, aligning your attribution model along all those different layers. Second being the foundations. We'll talk about each of these in more detail. And then it comes to the models themselves. And then finally, very importantly, incrementality. So first, I do want to just touch briefly on the importance of goal setting. So thinking back to those different measurement bodies, it's important to understand who the stakeholders are, what their objectives are, and how they will plan to use the model. I've personally seen cases where a model was built that surfaced valuable and actionable insights, but the client didn't have the resources or the ability to act on them. So that's obviously something you want to avoid, or we try to avoid. And to make another driving analogy, if you don't know where you're trying to go, you'll certainly never get there. So what does it look like to actually start to put something like this in place? You've probably heard the expression garbage in, garbage out when it comes to using data for modeling applications. Attribution models are no exception. Ensuring that you have high quality data sets sets the stage for being able to build your attribution model. So 4 key components of what you need to have in place to set yourself up for success. Kind of at the bottom, you need to have your analytics, tagging, architecture, and governance. This means having comprehensive campaign tagging across all of your owned and operated properties and data governance in place to ensure that your data is collected compliantly. And we also recommend having a means of being able to monitor that data collection going forward to ensure that you are remaining compliant over time. Second is data augmentation or enrichment. What we mean here is supplementing the data collected by the ad platforms by default, and then adding into that other attributes that can be useful. So that would be other first-party IDs or model data points, such as a predicted customer lifetime value. When we think back to what Simon was discussing about how one set of users for attribution is the platforms themselves and their algorithms. This is a way to enable better algorithmic performance within the platforms, and why this is an important step of the process. Third is what we'll call signal resolution, or considerations for things like portability. These often take the form of implementing capabilities like customer match or server-side tag management. And then finally is your marketing data warehouse. It's necessary to have all of the data you will use for your attribution model in one place, and at the granularity that your models require. We'll talk a bit more about what the cloud infrastructure looks like in terms of probabilistic attribution modeling, but this is a crucial step that you need to have all of your data there so that your analysts and data scientists can start to build their models. So now let's talk about the probabilistic models themselves. So today we're covering two types, and we'll start with the traditional MMM. So MMMs have been around for a long time. They've been widely used for over 40 years for their ability to estimate the impact of various marketing tactics on business performance. They can utilize a diverse range of data, including your historical sales data, your marketing spend across all of your channels, both offline and online, as well as the external factors that can affect your business, whether that's economic indicators, seasonality, market trends, or anything else there that has an effect. MMMs do use data collected in aggregate, whether that's like ad exposure metrics or spend, which do make them very flexible, as well as durable. So we talked about those considerations in terms of legislative changes, technical changes affecting the industry. MMMs, are better suited than deterministic models to exist in this new environment. When it comes to the business value, MMMs do provide a comprehensive view of marketing effectiveness, and they enable organizations to answer a few key questions. What is the interplay between channels, and what's an optimal way to allocate my budget across those channels? But it is important to point out that there are some key weaknesses with MMMs. The first being that there is a significant delay with getting insights from the model. Typically, MMMs are updated 2 to 4 times a year. So thinking back to that, like looking in the rearview mirror analogy, you're always acting on information that's typically about a quarter old at that point. So for that reason, they're typically used to guide higher level strategic decision-making, but in my opinion, are less useful for informing day-to-day tactical campaign level decisions. Which brings us to the second category of probabilistic models that we'll be covering today, which are we're calling them the faster MMM models, or probabilistic models that are reimagined for digital marketing. So under the hood, these models do look a lot like traditional MMMs, but they're evolved to address the weaknesses with traditional MMMs that we talk about, namely that infrequency of the model updates, as well as these models can provide more granular insights, which empower more tactical decision-making. Both InfoTrust and Tinuiti provide solutions within this category. InfoTrust solution is called Regression-Based Attribution. It's a durable and scalable model that provides attribution insights, as well as an interactive scenario planning tool to drive action and optimization. And then Tinuiti solution, called Rapid MMM, is a macro modeling methodology that is used to optimize portfolio performance by evaluating the relationship between media, marketing, and other factors that influence business outcomes. So to sum up, despite the prevalence of rules-based models for many years, probabilistic models like RBA or RMMM have emerged as an attribution solution that addresses the key challenges that we're seeing today with how consumers interact with brands.
And I think it's so tempting to hear that and go, Cool. There's a new form of probabilistic modeling that we can use to make decisions. Let's throw that at this problem, and then we'll all celebrate at the bank, which I think is a somewhat simplistic view. I think that one of the things or the nuances here, and that I chat with a lot of folks about, is this idea of triangulation. But triangulation is also just another buzzword when you think about what we're actually looking at here. But it really is this need to think about the framework that we're operating within. And again, thinking of the two people audiences, the two humans here in the loop, one being marketing leadership and one being those media managers. So I'm going to take the next few slides just to walk through the different elements here. But there are really three components that we're looking at. We're looking at incrementality testing for calibration mechanisms for the media mix model. We're looking at predictive lifetime value, so we can think about the effective ROAS tolerance that we'll maintain when we think about acquisition. And then we're thinking about the allocations or the investment recommendations that come out of that media mix model. So let's bring this to life a little bit, and let's dive into the incrementality testing piece. This is one of those areas that, again, gets a lot of lip service and board meetings. And I think a lot of folks are just broadly interested in, like, well, how do we look at incrementality? But there's always this fundamental trade-off with incrementality, right? Of one, it is a snapshot of a moment in time. And then two, it's also there's some risk, there's some loss potential associated with it. If you go with a holdout, or if you look to go through a heavy up initiative, then you've got to spend more money to figure this out. And this is not an entirely new construct. It's one that is built on the foundation of just statistically based experiments. And how do you understand how many treatments need to occur? What's your configuration for your experiment? So there is, again, that core value here as we think about providing that empirical evidence. But again, it is a snapshot of a moment in time. And that's why it shouldn't be used exclusively on its own. I think there's some interesting nuances out there from platforms like Measured and House when they're thinking about using incrementality models in somewhat of a predictive capacity. I think that actually has some really interesting legs to it. But again, it is not necessarily designed to solve all of your measurement problems. And this is, I think, the fundamental challenge with measurement, is that there are these multiple pieces that alone aren't enough. And you have to figure out, well, how do they all combine together? So if we actually were to walk through an example of an incrementality study, the most critical thing is understanding what our hypothesis is. And one of the interesting things that I've seen over the years at different marketing conferences is I've seen these presentations about remarketing. And remarketing is one of those things that I think draws a decent amount of contention in the marketing, in the broader marketing space. There will be the folks who are sort of always in the camp of it never works. And then there are folks who are in the camp of it does work. And the reality, I think, is both of them are wrong, is that remarketing can work at the right time in the right place. You just need to understand, is there incrementality associated with it? And in order to do that, you would go through a test where you have a treatment group and a control group. So the treatment group is where we'll be applying that ad, and the control group is where the absence of the ad will be noted. From there, we will track those two audiences through and understand if there was a lift in conversion relative to that baseline, right? Because there's always going to be an expectation that some of these folks will convert. And that's what we need to understand, is the delta in the efficacy of this treatment. If this treatment exists, does it actually improve our results, or would these have happened anyway? These are all fairly basic functions, but I think it is so critical that we understand the nuances of incrementality, that we understand, what are we testing? How do we design a test? How do we actually form a hypothesis that isn't remarketing works or it doesn't work? That's far too macro. Just like saying Google Ads works or it doesn't work. You have to be really mindful of going down at the tactical level, because the reality is, it both works and doesn't work simultaneously. So you just see the average, and maybe the average is okay, but that doesn't tell you anything about the tactics within the channel that you're really looking to optimize around. The nature of incrementality, though, is a complicated one. And I think one of the challenges we've seen in recent years has really been tied into the ad platforms themselves, that a lot of them have brought in-platform incrementality solutions to the table. And there's a lot of value in that, because it's democratizing access to incrementality. What it's not doing, though, is allowing for independent auditability, right? When you do an audience-based holdout, You can actually do this with less individuals, but you cannot calibrate it from the outside, or you cannot. It's a black box. That does present a challenge to advertisers. This is where I really lean toward the geo-based holdout approach. But of course, that's a very sort of US-centric view of the world, where we have these wonderful states that are all structured and we've got these DMAs and everything. It's much harder to do in other parts of the world. Additionally, there's also approaches like ghost bidding and always-on incrementality. There is a lot of value here, but these are really, really complicated to go about. So the core recommendation here is understand what you're looking to test, understand what incrementality would look like, what delta you think you'll be looking to observe, and then understand how to use a power calculation. These are all things, obviously, that anyone in the data science community should be pretty well versed in. I even studied it in psychology, interestingly enough. But once you've got your incrementality, once you know what lift is associated with a certain tactic, and you can use that to calibrate your media mix model, what you also then need to think about is, well, where is my point of diminishing returns? What does that look like? So when we're thinking about on the next slide, when we're thinking about perfect. So when we're thinking about understanding diminishing returns, what we're really looking to understand is the risk tolerance of a brand, right? I've often thought about this with like the Uber example. So when Uber first came in the market, they were willing to lose hundreds of dollars on first customer acquisition. Because they knew there was this incredibly powerful lifetime value associated with it. And lifetime value, I think, it's been in vogue for a number of years. It maybe fell out of vogue a little bit in terms of utility within the advertising space, but it is so useful for this particular scenario, and that is understanding what is your cost per acquisition tolerance. Having that number in mind gives you a much better understanding of how far you can go with certain channels. You may have a very risk-averse approach. You may know that, yeah, most of our customers actually do not come back and transact a second time. Or maybe you're a highly replenishment brand and you go, we will actually lose money on first transaction. That is okay. These are things, though, that are often just calibrated by opinion and not by data. So this is a critical step in the utility of your media mix models, to understand what is your tolerance for cost per acquisition. So once you've got those three pieces of the puzzle together, you're then able to take that to the executive team and have a really meaningful conversation about what expected marketing investment we are thinking will and its relative returns. And critically, you're then able to also have a conversation with the media manager about which tactics within those platforms are the ones that we think there's a lot more room to run with. And you may ultimately get to a situation where you find there is no more room to run within a given platform. And that is where you can start to open those doors and go, well, what about TikTok? What about LinkedIn? What about these other avenues that we maybe haven't historically considered? And you can really start to then test into those environments as well. But if we were to put a bit of a bow around this, I think there are three core elements to be thinking about here. The first one is to really strategize with a marketing mix model, to really think about the utility of this. Think about the opportunity for how do you go through budgeting at this moment in time? How do you think about this throughout the year? Is it scientific, or is it tied to a last touch strategy in Google Analytics that is not going to ultimately yield the potential for higher levels of investment and therefore growth? The second component is to start planning for action with an RBA or with a rapid MMM, or high velocity MMM, as we think about like the Robins of the world, the PyMCs, the Meridians, right? Those the tools are different. There is no there's a lot of similarities across them, but they do have their own nuances, and they do have their own biases. We'll frame it as. So no model is correct. There's ones that are less wrong than others, and this is about understanding your business context along with those models, and then finally really investing in a structured plan toward incrementality testing. The number of folks I've spoken to over the last few years who are like, oh, we've done incrementality testing, and I'm like, oh, really? Like, and they're like, yeah, we did one a couple of years ago, and it was pretty good. It's not this sort of like checkbox moment. It is a persistent scenario, and it's something where the most successful brands that I've seen have a learning agenda. They have a plan moving forward to say, we're going to run 3 incrementality tests this quarter, or we're going to, we have a plan for in what order we want to test. We want to go from macro to micro. These are smart decisions that brands are making when it comes to the long-term planning of their investment. But I think we're actually going to get a little bit real right now, Pam, right? I think you're going to actually dive into the weeds a bit.
Yes. So now that we've talked about what we mean by these probabilistic attribution models, the value they provide, the shortcomings of deterministic MMMs, and just how many of the different considerations are in play. Let's talk about what this could look like in Google Cloud Platform, specifically in Vertex AI. So we've touched on the importance of data is the foundation, correct? So you need to have all of your data in a marketing data warehouse. At InfoTrust, we recommend using BigQuery for that. And making sure you have your marketing data, your campaign data at the granularity you want for your modeling, alongside your conversions or sales data, or what it is you're looking to model. And then we like to use at InfoTrust Vertex AI for our analysis, model training, and then deploying the model. So why do we like Vertex AI for this? First, it simplifies data ingestion. This just comes down to the time that's required for your engineers, analysts, data scientists to be able to access the data that they need for analysis, and not needing to spend time moving data around or configuring environments for them to work in. We also like that we can streamline the attribution modeling process. So using pipelines, we can build reusable modeling pipelines efficiently, and then that sets us up for scaling models more widely within the organization. We did touch on our scenario planning tool. So by being able to deploy a model, that gives end users the ability to interact with it, do what if analysis type tests, and then get the insights and recommendations they need for allocating budgets or prioritizing incrementality tests. So, on top of having a learning agenda and planning for incrementality tests over the course of the year, there's still an important element of prioritization. There are probably infinite hypotheses that you could go out and test, but of course not infinite resources to be able to do that. So being able to prioritize those tests is an important step of the process. And then finally, the scalability to handle large data sets. BigQuery is a serverless solution, meaning that your teams don't need to dedicate any resources to managing workloads or availability. Same with Vertex AI pipelines. So this is just another piece that this is a scalable solution that can meet the needs of your organization, whether you've got a small portfolio of channels or something far more complex. And so finally, just to visualize what this might look like, over here on the left, we have your ad platforms. So your marketing data across all of the channels where you're advertising today, bringing that into your marketing data warehouse, and then being able to use that data for modeling, training the modeling analysis pipelines, deploying that model to an endpoint. We use Colab for our scenario planning tool, so being able to connect to that. And then finally, this last piece that we keep coming back to, which is the model is not useful to anyone unless it's unless it's informing real optimizations that are happening within the ad platforms themselves. So that being shown here on the far right. So as to wrap up, we just wanted to summarize with 3 key takeaways. So keep these guiding principles in mind as you're on your attribution journey. Know what decision you're seeking to enable. What are the outcomes to be achieved? What questions need to be answered? Attribution models are only useful if they're being used to guide action. Be mindful of your constituents. Never lose sight of who the end users are, what their objectives are, and their ability to take action based on the insights of the model. And then finally, the importance of testing. Incrementality testing, in my opinion, is the best tool in our toolbox for being able to prove the value of marketing initiatives. Use it frequently, use various types, and that'll kind of be able to provide the best, most well-rounded insights as to how your marketing dollars are working for you. So thank you for joining us today. We will transition over in a moment to Q&A, but I did want to just call out that in November, on the 20th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, my colleague Nidal will be presenting on 5 features in GA4 that will improve your data insights. Nidal has many years of experience in analytics and is a very insightful speaker, so I'm confident that'll be a great session. So if you're interested, please check that out and register to attend. And so with that, if you have questions, feel free to post them either in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we will talk through them. Thank you.
All right, we have a couple questions that have popped up here. Let me just pull them up. All right. For one question, would it make sense to have multiple attribution models? Our team's been relying on MMM for years, so it would be a tough sell to replace it with a completely new one.
Yes, this is a great question and one that definitely comes up from time to time. So as we talked about how there's no silver bullet for attribution, I personally, don't recommend just saying, hey, throw away all of those models that you've been using so far and replace it with this new thing that, is new and different from what anyone on your team has used before. That's certainly not the approach I would recommend. Instead, we did try to highlight today that each of the different models does have benefits. There are cases where a deterministic model may make sense. There are cases where an MMM model does provide a lot of value. So, I personally believe to have kind of a well-rounded view, you can use these different models together and lean on them for what their individual strengths are.
Yeah, and one note I would just add to that is, the nature of MMM fundamentally is one of multiple models are being presented at that moment, right? There is a model selection process that is happening at that moment in time. And so what I would say is, if there are depending on your degree of confidence, and that is something that, again, you calibrate through, this is what we thought we should spend here, and we saw the results. We saw, we were able to sort of effectively predict the future. Depending on your degree of confidence in that particular scenario, that will then determine the degree to which you need to think about alternative selection biases or alternative selection methods. And I would really look at that framework. I don't think the idea of sort of having multiple MMMs is necessarily something that is going to be tolerable to most companies. And also, frankly, I think you're just overcomplicating the scenario there when you already do have a multi-model situation going on within an MMM to begin with.
All right. Do we want to dive into one around AI? Just how does AI really play into this larger discussion with attribution and this type of measurement?
I mean, I think AI, there are so many angles you can take on any question pertaining to AI, right? Because there is, how do you measure the effect of sort of, AI driven algorithm, AI campaign structures, for example, like Performance Max? I think that presents some inherent challenges based on the nature of how we're thinking about inventory selection and so forth. And I think I've seen folks use some scripts to try and sort of segment out search from YouTube. That gets a little bit complicated. I think the cleanest, and actually I did an episode with of the Measure Up podcast with Dr. Ramla Jara like a year ago, and her whole big thing is AI and MMM. So I guess I'll plug that. Go take a listen to that episode. But I think one of the fundamental considerations here is there is a classification exercise that has to happen when you think about the data ingress moment, and that is typically quite difficult, because there's a lot of human error propensity and all these pieces. I think the use case that I'm most akin or most favorable for is AI utility for understanding or for making modifications of that classification process. That's part one. And then part two is, One of the things that I think is really interesting about AI, and I was listening to this podcast recently about like medical, just medical science in general, and they talk about solving for cancer, and there are certain cancers that get a lot of funding, and a lot of scientists spend a lot of time thinking about them. And when you do that, you ultimately open the door to this potential to start to observe things that are hidden in plain sight, right? Like if there are 50 different trends happening simultaneously, someone will eventually observe one of those things if they spend enough time looking at it. I think that's where AI becomes particularly interesting, is finding those sort of subcurrent trends within the data. So when you're looking at the output, you're looking at the outcome. I think that is where AI utility from an analysis point of view can have a lot of value beyond that sort of like macro outcome of this is really interesting to us, but to better understand, well, what trends are below the surface, and critically, how predictable are certain inputs? And maybe some of them are highly volatile, and you need to have some degree of bias calibration built into the model.
Yeah, one thing to add when we think about how AI plays into this discussion is I do want to tie it back to knowing who your stakeholders and your end users are, because yes, AI is the buzzword right now and everyone's very excited, but I personally have been in a situation where the end users were not ready or comfortable for an AI-driven solution, right? That just would have been too much of a leap from where they were today and how they operate. So I think there's, yes, as Simon described, there is a role that AI can play and a lot of value can add, but just because it can provide value doesn't always mean it's the right solution for who on the other side needs to trust and have confidence in the insights that are coming out.
Thank you both. We've got a couple more questions rolling in. One geared toward trust here. How can one address extremely high seasonality or event-driven behavior in MMM and RMMM models where behavior changes dramatically week to week? So I think we're 2 days away. I imagine this might be something like a Spirit Halloween, or if you have high seasonality like that, how can you use these types of models?
Pam, do you want to kick it? I'm happy. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I can share some initial thoughts, but certainly please jump in. I do believe that the range of tools that we have in our toolbox for probabilistic models are well suited for handling seasonality, right? There are a number of different ways that you can control for that in the models and how you build your feature sets out. So obviously, different businesses have different seasonal patterns and things like that, but with adequate historical data and being able to track that over time, and I think maybe perhaps there's an element of like thinking and being a little clever about, well, what are the indicators that we want to include that can help us to control for the effects of that seasonality? I mean, yes, that's some extra effort and prep on the side of the person building the modeler, but it's not something that like inherently scares me or makes me think like, an MMM or a higher velocity MMM is not going to be adequate for those types of scenarios.
Yeah, and just a note on the dramatic shifts week to week. The further you zoom into anything that would resemble a pattern at a macro level, the more volatility that you will ultimately observe, right? If you were to try and go down to like an hourly grain, you will see, even if on average you get 100 conversions a day, it can be pretty sporadic, and you may randomly start to get like 20 conversions at 3 a.m, right? Like these are hard. That level of phenomena is hard to account for if you have to exist to that grain. And I think this is where I would look at a scenario where you need to abstract a little and remove the degree of coarseness that you're looking at. So is there a observable pattern, perhaps not at the week to week level, but if you were to look at a 2 weeks or monthly structure there, I think like that would also be a consideration. But at the end of the day, this all comes down to model tuning and the degree to which you're coding in bias or that you're coding in different sort of real world attributes. So there are sort of just like the ice cream and murder rate piece, like there's real world data sets out there that may assist with the prediction that you can use to better calibrate your model to account for those in the future.
Yes, and I guess just one more thing to add is that, we are talking about models here. They are an imperfect representation of reality. They can paint you a pretty good picture and be very useful and help you drive actual results. But any model that you build is never a complete representation of reality. And so just to emphasize Simon's point there about like the coarseness, yes, if you zoom in, you'll see a lot of noise and variability, but that doesn't mean, just because there are some elements of your data that are still unexplained doesn't mean that there aren't the insights that are coming out that are explained, aren't useful.
All right, we've got two more here. What advice do you have for a marketing analytics group who's struggling to organize their data in a single MDW? Are there tools or strategies that ease this transition?
Simon, do you want to take this one? I'm thinking.
I'm happy to lead in. I think this is both a psychological problem as much as it is a data problem. And ultimately what it comes down to is mapping out expectations of utility. I think a lot of organizations start with, we're going to build the house without necessarily the purpose in mind of what it needs to be able to do once you've built it. And so there is a degree of needing to reverse engineer that. Now, there are all kinds of organizational politics in play, and I think this is where politics, policies, all these things that you need to be accounting for. And so it's not a data-centric answer. This is a psychological study of the workplace and understanding who are the key actors involved in this process. Are you aligned with what their outcomes and expectations are of the value here? And critically, are you all architecting toward the same outcome, or do you have reasons why individuals think about it in different capacities? I think that is, divergent outcomes is the most common reason why I see points of failure here. And then, frankly, trying to eat an entire apple in one bite has never worked for anyone. And so in this particular scenario, you do have to think about, how do you piecemeal, how do you compartmentalize the elements that we're talking about here, particularly when it comes to like data granularity, for instance. I see a lot of these projects often will fail when the schema just becomes massively robust. And it's like, well, if we need it, that way we have it. And I don't think that is, I think it's a great idea and a great theory. It's not a real practical application. And so we have to be okay with, frankly, getting 80% of the way there with perhaps somewhat incomplete data, and you are making progress toward the ideal outcome there.
All right. One last one, and I appreciate everybody. I see people from the UK on here. I see people from the States, a lot from India attending this. So I appreciate everybody for all the time zones staying up with us for this webinar. And maybe with this last question, backing out to a very broad question, when you have all those personas at play, I think Simon's referencing your slide there of measurements. How have you seen change actually accepted in an organization? I think this might be asking, how do you get buy-in? How do you change the trajectory of that ship that they might have been on for so long?
This is, I'd say this is again tied very closely into organizational politics, and critically, this begins and ends with empathy. The idea of turning a cruise ship is complex and requires multiple individuals to all be engaged simultaneously. I would genuinely ask when the last time you sat down with your CFO was, outside of, say, a board meeting or outside of a major meeting where a decision was being made, and actually got to a point of empathy with them, spent time educating them on, this is the way that I think about these things. Or like, I know you want to make plans you want to budget in certain ways, but here's actually how the budgeting needs to work inside of the platform. And what it really comes down to is just understanding each other's roles and each other's desire to make certain decisions. I think there is a lot of education that can be done across organizations, and the best way to do education is through storytelling. The reason I told that story about Tom Brady at the front is because it's incredibly approachable. It's disarming. We all know who Tom Brady is. We all know what a dropped call sounds like, right? Like, those are really easy ways to talk about the fallacy of deterministic attribution with incomplete data sets. that is, again, not the way that I approach that out of the gate. I approach it through a story. And I think if you can come to the table with stories that breed empathy and that enable folks who don't work in this function day to day to understand what you're hoping to achieve, that will hopefully bring more folks to the table. And then critically, ensuring that you have a plan to get through this, or like, well, what does the future look like versus just we can't use this model anymore. I think coming to the table with like just isolating problems and not necessarily having a roadmap is quite frankly a little scary to folks, and CFOs in particular don't like risk. They really don't like having to change models or solutions. But the reality is that will inhibit your growth more than anything else if your CFO does not understand what the CMO needs to do.
Awesome. And with that, I think we've answered most of our questions here. If anyone else has any other questions, we're here. You feel free to contact us at either InfoTrust or Tinuiti. Contact Simon, contact Pam, myself. You see the email addresses right there on the screen. So yeah, we will have a recap. We're just chatting now. We'll have a recap of this webinar. We'll have a recap of the Q&A as well. So very much appreciate everybody staying on for just about the full hour, and really hope you got some value out of this. And if any other questions come up, we're here to support you.